What's going on, YouTube? Welcome back, everyone. This is Lee, and yes, today's the day we'll be taking a look at the Nikon ZF with the 28mm lens versus the Leica Q. So with all that said, let's begin. So right before we get started, I just want to first point out that the Leica Q is my own unit. I recently purchased that used. And also, if you've been watching my videos, you know that the Nikon ZF and the 28 is also my unit as well. So with all that out the way, let's begin. So the Leica Q versus the Nikon ZF. Let's first take a look at the Leica Q price. The Leica Q came out roughly around 2015, costing $4,250 USD. But of course, the used market, it can vary. But I picked mine up for $2,500, great condition, but it also depends on the shutter count. So definitely keep that in mind. Now with the Nikon ZF, it came out roughly around 2023 at $2,000 USD, and the 28mm came out roughly around 2021, which cost $300 USD. And so in combination, this is a $2,300 combo, brand new. But if you look at the used market for the Nikon ZF and the 28mm, you could probably pick one up for $1,600 together, $1,700 maybe. But it depends on the market and what we're going through, if you know what I mean. Now, with that said, let's take a look at some quick specs. Now, the Leica Q sports a full frame 24 megapixel CMOS sensor, whereas the Nikon ZF sports a 24 megapixel full frame BSI CMOS sensor. So that's going to be interesting. Now, let's take a look at the glass. Now, on the Leica, it sports a Summilux 28mm 1.7 aperture lens. It has 11 elements, 9 groups, 3 spherical lenses, 9 aperture blades, and a 49mm filter thread, whereas the Nikon Z20mm sports 9 elements and 8 groups, 2 spherical lenses, 7 aperture blades with a 52mm filter thread. Now, let's take a look at the back of the camera. Now at the back of the camera, the EVF, the Leica sports a 3,680,000 dot resolution screen, whereas the Nikon sports a 3,690,000 dot resolution EVF screen. And if you look at the monitor screen, the Leica sports a fixed 3-inch screen, whereas Nikon sports a articulating 3.2-inch screen. And as for the resolution, the Leica sports a 1,040,000 dot resolution, whereas the Nikon sports a 2,100,000 dot resolution. And speaking of screen, let's take a look at this screen brightness. Now, as for the Leica Lux reading, it's roughly around 421, whereas the Nikon comes in at 648 lux. Now, as we take a look at the I/O on the side of the camera, the Leica sports a micro USB socket and also a HDMI socket, whereas the Nikon sports a micro HDMI socket, headphone jack, mic jack, and also a USB-C. Now, as we take a look at the top of the cameras, as you can see, the aperture ring is located at the front of the lens, not at the rear of the lens, because of the macro switch, which we'll get into later on. And also it sports a shutter dial, a off, single, and continuous switch, which drives me crazy because whenever I turn on the camera for single, I end up hitting the continuous and I just shoot 5 shots for no reason. So that just drives me crazy, but I digress. It also has a record button. Very simple layout, very cool looking layout. I like it. Also for the Nikon, it's trying to mimic a film-like camera. It has a ISO dial, shutter dial, exposure, and also your record button and your shutter button right there. So there we go. Now, as we take a look at the bottom of the camera, this is where the power, the battery, and the SD cards are located at. Now, the Leica sports a BP DC12, which costs roughly around 100 USD, whereas the Nikon sports a EN EL15C, which costs roughly around 60 USD. And according to the CIPA, the Nikon will give you more shots over the Leica. Now, let's take a look at the memory situation. And as you can see, you could use one SD card on the Leica, whereas the Nikon, you can use a micro SD and a SD card in the Nikon ZF. And speaking about cards, let's take a look at the buffer. Now here is the Leica. And here is the Nikon. And as you can hear, the Nikon will give you more shots than the Leica. So there we go. And since we're still at the bottom of the camera, let's take a look at the quarter screw situation. If you're using Manfrotto plates for your tripod, it is not convenient. It's gonna be very difficult to take out your battery. So I would definitely recommend a small Arca Swiss plate for your tripod. That will definitely help you with removing the battery from your camera while it's mounted on the tripod. So there we have it. Now let's take a look around the camera. The Leica sports a magnesium alloy build. The whole camera is basically just metal. It has an aluminum top. Also, the lens has a leaf shutter, but the down part is that the camera, the Leica Q1, the Leica Q is not weather resistant. Now, the Nikon ZF is made out of magnesium alloy. You do get some brass dials, so it'll change color over time. There's some plastic panels and a leaf switch, and the camera is weather resistant. So there we go. Now let's take a closer look at these lenses. The Leica is a full metal build. As stated before, the aperture ring is located at the front of the lens, whereas at the rear of the lens, there's a macro feature. Once you turn it on, your camera becomes in macro mode at 2.8 aperture. Also, there is a feature for the focusing. You could lock your focus to do autofocus, but if you want to quickly go to manual focus, you could unlock it and go to manual. Now, for the Nikon, it's a plastic build and there is just a focus ring. Also, if you want to change the focus to manual instead of autofocus, that needs to go through the camera. And also the lens is not weather resistant. So even though the ZF is weather resistant, the lens is not weather resistant. So that's not good. So hopefully maybe Mark II we get some weather resistant features and maybe a manual focus to autofocus switch on a 28mm. Maybe in the future, we'll see. Now, when it comes to startup, the Nikon ZF is faster than the Leica by 1 second, I believe. Also, when you look at the menus, I will say I love the menu settings in the Leica and I know what it means. Whereas the Nikon, if you never use a Nikon, you're gonna have a learning curve, that's for sure. But the Leica, there was no learning curve. It was straightforward. I love that. Now, when it comes to autofocus, let's not even talk about Nikon right now. Autofocus Nikon is pretty, today's standards, is very active. You don't need to always aim for your shot. It will aim it for you. Whereas the Leica, you're either doing single point on this camera or you're touch autofocusing on your system to take that shot. So that's what we're dealing with right here. Is not as advanced as the Nikon, obviously. This is 2015. Keep in mind, Nikon was still doing DSLRs those days, right? Did it Ashton Kutcher did our Nikon mirrorless back in the days? I forget. Now with all that out the way, let's take a look at our first test. And this is going to start off everything, the distortion test. Number one, I will say that the Leica has slight distortion over the Nikon, but I also noticed that the Leica is slightly wider than the Nikon. So throughout this entire test, the Leica will be slightly wider than the Nikon, which is very interesting. I did not know that. So this is why we do reviews. There we go. Now as for the vignetting test, this is really important. Now at 2.8, the Leica is better on the vignetting than the Nikon, and at 4, the Nikon seems to be just a tad better than the Leica. Now, if you pay attention throughout this test, if you take a look at the center of the image on the Leica, there seems to be a bright spot at the center of this white paper that I have right here. And so just want to throw that out there. I just noticed that, and that must be the special sauce in the Leica perhaps. So there's just a tad like circle of brightness in the middle of this scene. So there we go. Just want to throw that out there. Hopefully you guys see the same thing, or I'm crazy. Leave a comment down below. Now as for the next test, this is the bokeh ball test. I'm going to let you guys decide on which one is better, but I will say that due to the focus distance difference, the Nikon is slightly closer, whereas Leica is wider. The bokeh balls on the Nikon is going to be bigger than the Leica, obviously. So there we go. Now as for this next test, this is the ISO test. I will say that the Leica is actually slightly noisier than the Nikon. So there we go. Now for the next test, this is the chromatic aberration test. I will say that the Leica does better in chromatic aberration control over the Nikon. Now as for the flare test, I'm shooting directly at the sun. As you can see in this test, I noticed that there's a slight bluish dot on the Leica, but for the Nikon, there is a green, soft, like cast dot flare in the center of the lens. So yeah, I just want to throw it out there. So you're getting all green, or you get a green or blue on the Leica. Depends what you like. So I don't know which one is good or bad. So leave a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think. Now let's take a look at the sunburst. Now, if you're looking at the sunburst, I will say that the Leica has more character than the Nikon. Those 9 blades right there. There we go. Better sunburst on the Leica. Now, in terms of dynamic range overexposed, this is where I overexpose my shot and I pull back down the dynamic range. And in my honest opinion, throughout this entire test, I will say that the Nikon has better dynamic range in overexposed shots than the Leica Q. Now for this next test, this is the compression test. You guys get to see the background blur when you're focusing on a subject in the midground. And of course, having a 1.7 aperture, you get more blur on the Leica over the Nikon, obviously. Now let's get a little closer to this subject right here. Now, as we get 3 feet away from the subject, I would say that the Leica at 1.7 will give you more background blur than the Nikon at 2.8, obviously. Also, if you think about it, if you're just matching up 2.8 versus 2.8, technically Nikon will give you just a tad slightly more compression than the Leica, since the Leica is slightly further away due to its view angle. And so with that in mind, it's very minor. And now let's take a look at the macro on this. It is crazy that Leica has these capabilities back in 2015. You could get even closer to your subject than the Nikon. This is insane. This gives you another dimension in your photography right there. Look how close I am to the exact same subject. I'm just basically inside this branch right here. I'm like, what in the world I'm doing? The Nikon can't even focus this close. So there we have it, giving you more dimensions in your shooting by Leica. There we go, 2015. Now here is the dynamic range low light test. This is where I underexpose my shots and pull out the exposure. And here is the results. The Nikon does better than the Leica. And also I want to mention that the Leica goes to electronic shutter after 2000 shutter speed. But even before that, it doesn't do well regardless. So there we have it. Nikon is better at dynamic range than the Leica. Now as for the next test, this is the sharpness test. Let's take a look at the bottom left corner of the image. And I will say that the Leica is slightly sharper than the Nikon on the foreground at wide open aperture. Around 2.8, the Leica seems to be slightly brighter than the Nikon, and at f4, the Nikon seems to be slightly brighter than the Leica. And that's probably due to that vignetting test that we saw. This is how the lens react in certain situations. And throughout the entire aperture range, it looks slightly more or less the same. But leave a comment down below. Now here is the mid bottom of the image. I will say that crazy enough, around 2.8, the Leica is slightly brighter than the Nikon, whereas f4, the Nikon is slightly brighter than the Leica. But in terms of sharpness, it looks very close. I might give the edge to Leica, but it's so subtle, no one can really tell unless you really want to go in 300%. But it's slightly sharper on the Leica, just a tad sharper. Now as for the bottom right corner of the image, I will say that the foreground of the Leica is a tad sharper in focus than the Nikon. Nikon seems to be slightly blurry, and everything else seems to be more or less the same. Now as we take a look at the mid right of the image, I can definitely say that around 2.8 and f4, the Leica, if you take a look at the background elements from the sliding board, that's about 15 feet away. The elements are actually more sharper than the Nikon. That's due to the lens curvature. And here's the center of the image. And I will say roughly around 2.8 and f4, I think that the background is slightly a tad sharper on the Leica just by a hair. And that is very interesting. And that's due to the lens curvature on the Leica. So there we have it. But everything else seems to be more or less the same. And as for the mid left of the image, I will say that, 2.8 is just a tad brighter than the Nikon. And at the f4 part, Nikon is slightly brighter than the Leica. So there we go. But in terms of sharpness, I will give it to the Leica. It's just a teeny tad sharper than the Nikon. But definitely leave your comments down below. Let me know what you think. But definitely hit pause and just look at it. But overall wise, yeah, Leica is just a tad sharper than the Nikon. And that's pretty cool because that's 2015 versus 2021 lens right there. So there we have it. Boom. So just wrap things up, the Leica Q versus the Nikon ZF with the 20mm 2-point aperture lens. At the end of the day, each camera has their own pros and cons. And I know a lot of people right now in the Leica world, if you bought your Leica in 2015, yes, your camera is still at a really high quality today. It just needs some, fixes here and there, which they did over the years in the Q2 and the Q3, but we're talking about the Q, right? So in terms of the Q, because I know a lot of you guys might be buying the Q on the used market, in terms of the Q, it has excellent sharpness. You get your macro features, handling is awesome, full metal. It's a very easy system. I love the menu settings. I just knew what I was doing when I was using the camera on the first day. Now for some cons on the Q, number one, battery issues, right? You need to buy at least 4 batteries for that system. Number two, there's no weather resistant on that system. So make sure you do have a cover for your camera, right? Number three, video. There's video, but it's 1080p. There's no 4K. The autofocus is vintage. Just to put it nicely, 2015 autofocus, mirrorless, just put it that way. And also last but not least, definitely the electronic shutter after 2000. Yeah, that's not, don't think I were ever gonna use anything higher than that. It has some weird rolling shutter thing going on. So that's my take on the Q. I know they fixed a lot of that in the Q2 and the Q3. And also one more thing. A flip screen. There's no flip screen on the Q. That's some, shortcomings on the Leica Q. And also, if you've been watching me on my live stream, on my Instagram, I just want to put this out there. It froze on me 3 times already. So that's, the tech that's in the system, the motherboard and all that jazz. I don't know how long that's going to last because it's 2015 tech right there. And my friend just fixed his Leica Q from a lens bump, and it cost him $2,000. So that's just something for you guys to definitely consider when picking up a Q1. Now, for the Nikon ZF, everything was pretty much good to go, right? You get your, autofocus, you get your dynamic range, your ISO performance, overexposed, underexposed, you get all of that, right? But unfortunately, the lens, the 20mm, that lens caused a lot of ruckus because it is good for what it is, but it's not Leica good, right? You don't get that sharpness like the Leica does, the lens curvature. You can render more in the background than just the midground that you're aiming at. And I wish Nikon can do some of those slick features like macro, right? Like, autofocus, manual focus switches, and it's just so intuitive, especially for a Nikon ZF, which is supposed to mimic a film camera, right? So maybe a version 2 down the very, very long road ahead, maybe, right? But until then, if you're trying to do pure image quality with good lighting only, Leica Q is probably the way to go. But the Nikon ZF, it's interchangeable, so you could change any lens you want. But if we're talking about the 28mm versus a Summilux, there is no match right here, guys. There is no match. I love Nikon, by the way. I'm a Nikon fanboy, but there's no match right here, guys. I can't fake it right here. There's no match. But anyways, thank you guys for checking me back. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Definitely click like and subscribe. And also, don't forget to leave your comments down below. Let me know what video you guys want to watch next. What should I focus on? Just let me know your thoughts. But anyways, thank you guys so much. I'll see you guys in the next one, all right? Take it easy. Peace.